What's up, everybody? I have here Chapter 10 of Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, Duel at Araluen. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maddie rode steadily through the morning, pausing at intervals to allow Bumper to rest. After several hours, she reached the banks of the Wessel. The river ran fast and deep, and she knew she'd have to look for a ford. She checked her map, and then the surrounding countryside, finding the deep bend in the river they'd picked as a rendezvous point. It was a half a kilometer to the east. The hill fort was approximately 5 kilometers west of her current position. Might as well look closer to the fort, she muttered, and turned Bumper's head to the left, riding westward along the riverbank in search of a place to cross. In less than a kilometer, she found a spot where the river widened. The current ran more slowly in consequence, and she could see the sandy bottom, barely 1.5 meters below the river's surface. Checking upstream and downstream to make sure she wasn't observed, she urged her little horse into the river. At first, the water reached barely to Bumper's knees, but after 10 meters or so, it rose rapidly until it was just below the saddle. "Steady now, boy," she crooned. "Take it easy." If the water level continued to rise at the rate that it had, she would be swimming before too long, and the prospect of a night in wet clothes didn't appeal to her. Under her cautious urging, Bumper went on, a pace at a time. The water came up a few centimeters more, then stopped rising. With increasing confidence, Bumper strode on, sending wide, V-shaped ripples out across the placid surface. "Take it easy, I said," she ordered. He shook his mane at her. "I'm fine. I can see where I'm going." She was about to argue when she realized he was right. Logically, if the water grew deeper, the current would flow more slowly. Bumper could feel the river bottom underfoot and sense the strength of the current against him, so he could tell, by the force of the water, whether the river was growing deeper or shallower. After a few more meters, the water level fell until it barely reached his belly. "Told you so. Just keep walking. Slowly," she told him. If the water suddenly became deeper, she wanted plenty of time to stop him and to keep herself relatively dry. Bumper snorted derisively, but he moved more slowly and more carefully. Then the water was shallowing rapidly, and he bounded forward across the sand bottom, showering silver spray into the air as he made his way toward the far bank. And here we are. He trotted the last few meters through the water that was now only 10 centimeters deep, pausing as his feet touched dry ground to shake himself massively. Water cascaded in all directions. A lot of it landed on Maddie. "Did you have to do that?" she asked. Bumper craned his neck round to make eye contact. "Not really. Just felt like it." Not for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to have a horse who wasn't fond of practical jokes. She brought him to a halt, and, taking her feet from the stirrups, removed her boots, one after the other, and poured the water out of them. Her tights would have to wait until later. She wriggled uncomfortably in the saddle, feeling the wet cloth squishing against the leather. The terrain here was similar to what she had been traveling through for most of the previous days. Thickly wooded areas, interspersed with open meadows and grasslands. She stood in the stirrups and surveyed the ground on either side. There was no sign of any movement, no sign of people. She nudged Bumper around so that he was pointing west, and set him to a slow canter along the cleared land of the riverbank. Later, when she judged they were closer to the hill fort, she would reduce the pace to a walk to keep the noise down. As it was, the horse's hoofs thudded softly on the thick grass underfoot, making barely any sound. It was a warm morning, and with the wind of their passage, her clothes quickly began to dry. They were still damp, but not uncomfortably so. The squishing had stopped, at least. After a while, the trees closed right down to the riverbank, and she had to swing north, looking for a game trail or a farm track to follow. She found one that meandered through the trees in a general westerly direction. The ruts made by generations of farm cart wheels passing this way were all too obvious. After several kilometers winding through the tree trunks, stooping low in the saddle to avoid low-hanging branches, she checked the reins softly. "Ease down a little, boy," she said in a low voice. They had made good time, and the hill ford must be close by now. That meant that the Red Fox clan's camp must be getting closer too, and, for all she knew, there might be hunters or foragers from the camp moving through the woods, searching for small game. They continued on at a reduced pace. Then she stopped Bumper altogether and swung down from the saddle. "You're leaving me here?" "Afraid so. I might have to take cover in a hurry. Bit hard to do that with a walloping great horse along." He sniffed derisively, but, for once, let her have the last word, as she gestured for him to move off the track they had been following, and to conceal himself among the trees. "Don't go anywhere. I won't be long," she told him. She unslung her bow and ghosted down the track. Her feet made barely a sound on the soft ground. After years of training with Will, it was second nature for her to set them down carefully and softly, no matter how fast she was moving, avoiding twigs and deadfalls in her path, sensing those that she didn't see, and stopping herself from placing any weight on them. That long practice meant she could move this way at a normal walking pace. Every so often she paused, turning her head this way and that to see whether she could hear anyone else moving along the track or among the trees to either side. She kept her cowl tossed back on her shoulders so she could hear more clearly. There was nothing but the normal forest sounds: birds chirping in the undergrowth, small creatures scuttling to avoid her through the leaf mold that formed the forest floor, and the occasional whispering rush of a larger animal, perhaps a badger or a fox, as it paralleled her trail through the trees. The trees began to thin out until she could see for 100 meters to either side, as the forest gradually gave way to grassland. Eventually, she emerged on a wide meadow that sloped away uphill. She stopped within the tree fringe, concealed in the shadows, and checked the open ground ahead, searching once more for any sign of people moving. She must be close to the Red Fox camp by now, she reasoned. And as she had the thought, 2 figures appeared above the rim of the hill, striding down the slope toward the spot where she stood. The temptation to duck back into the cover of the trees was almost overpowering, but she knew it would be a fatal mistake to do so. Movement would draw their eyes to her in an instant. They might not see who she was, but they would know that someone had moved and had retreated into the shadow of the trees. And if she were seen to retreat, she would be seen as a possible enemy. After all, if she was a friend or another member of the clan, there would be no reason to move into concealment. Heart pounding as they approached, she stood frozen in place against the trunk of a large oak. She was in shadow, and the cloak draped around her, concealing her form, blending with the mottled bark of the oak tree. Her cowl was up. She had pulled it up when she reached the more open ground, and her face was hidden in shadow. Now, the only course she had was the one that had been drummed into her brain repeatedly over the past 3 years by her teacher and mentor. Trust the cloak. She followed the path of the 2 approaching men, moving only her eyes to keep track of them. At first, they had seemed to be heading straight for her, but now she could see that they were veering off to her right. They would pass close by the spot where she stood, barely 4 meters away, if they maintained their present direction. That should be far enough, she thought. Should be. The words echoed in her brain. Briefly, she wondered what she would have done if they had continued straight toward her. Probably, her best course of action would have been to inch slowly around the tree, moving so slowly and so gradually that the movement would be almost imperceptible. She was glad it hadn't come to that. Movement was the last course open to her. It was better to stay stock still, wrapped in the cloak, blending into the background. She could hear the men talking now. At first, their voices were a low mumble, the words indistinguishable. But, as they drew closer, she began to make out what they were saying. Why we should bother with an attack? We can simply wait them out. They must be short of food by now. The general says it's to keep them off balance, to keep them guessing. We've hit them from the front, so tomorrow night he wants a raid on the north wall. Get behind them. Make them edgy. Waste of time, I say. Maybe not. We've not tried anything for a few days. Who knows? We might catch them napping and put an end to this whole thing. Or we might not, and those archers are too good to mess around with. We've lost too many men already. Now he's risking another 40. That's why he wants a night attack. What they can't see, they can't shoot. I suppose that's right. Still, first chance I get, I'm pulling back. Dark or not, one of those archers is a ranger. They can hit their targets in the dark. They're demons, some folks say. In spite of the situation, Maddie smiled to herself. It had been some time since she had heard anyone voice that sentiment. A lot of simple country people in Araluen believed that rangers were some kind of dark wizards, able to appear and disappear at will, and their skill with a bow was close to legendary. As with anything that people didn't fully understand, it became exaggerated the more it was discussed. The man near her obviously believed that members of the Corps could see in the dark. The voices faded as the two men moved in among the trees and continued on their way. She frowned thoughtfully, remaining still until they were long gone. The foxes were obviously planning a night raid for the following night, and on the back wall of the fort. That man might be right. They might catch the defenders off guard. Night battles were always uncertain affairs. It would be useful if she could get some kind of warning to her father about the planned attack. Deciding that the men were well out of sight by now, she continued up the hill, moving in a low crouch across the long grass as it waved in the moderate breeze. There was a natural rhythm to the movement of the grass, and the shadows of the clouds that drove across the sky. She matched that rhythm, blending into the very fabric of the countryside. The cloak made her a difficult mark to spot, and her smooth, steady approach helped her fade into the background around her. She had seen Will demonstrate this kind of movement many times, and she knew it worked. Often she had lost sight of him, even though she knew exactly where he was, and where he would reappear. After training with him for 3 years, she was confident in her ability to cross relatively open ground and remain unnoticed. Not unseen. A watcher might see her, but he wouldn't be aware of what he was seeing. She sank lower to the ground as she approached the crest of the hill, until she was almost doubled over, the long grass reaching up to conceal her. Finally, she dropped to her hands and knees, then onto her belly, moving forward under the impetus of her elbows and knees, virtually invisible in the gray-green grass. Her eyes came level with the crest, and she slid forward another meter to see more clearly. There, below her, the hill sloped down again to a flat field where the foxes had their camp. There must have been at least 50 tents pitched by a small stream that ran through the meadow, tumbling down from the hill beyond. Men moved back and forth among the tents, but without any sense or appearance of urgency. Smoke rose from their cook fires, and the waft of grilling meat came to her. Somewhere, someone was repairing a piece of armor or a weapon, and she could hear the ring of a hammer on steel. Interestingly, she noted, the foxes had posted no sentries on this side of their camp. They weren't expecting any enemies to appear from behind them. And that might come back to bite you, she thought. Then she raised her eyes and let them travel up the far hill, taking in the terraced path that ran round and round it, spiraling upward to the wooden fort at the very top. She could see figures on the parapet as the defenders kept watch on the camp below. A large lump formed in her throat as she focused on one, leaning on the parapet, to one side of the main gate. It was too far to make out his features, but the body language, the way he leaned, and then the way he moved as he took a few paces to the side, was unmistakable. She knew in that instant that she was watching her father. "Hello, Dad. I'm here," she whispered, her voice husky. All right, that's going to bring us to the conclusion of Chapter 10. I want to thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time in Chapter 11. God bless, and have a good one.